10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Welcome to the Internet Drive with Gregory Wordsmith.
In your car,
at work,
at home,
on your smartphone.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen.
And now, here is your host.
Greetings, Sanbonani, Dumelang, Molweni, and Avusheni, fellow South Africans. I go by the name Gregory Wordsmith, your host with the most of the Internet Drive with Gregory Wordsmith, a podcast that is aimed at discussing social issues affecting young people and young professionals. Coming to you straight from Pretoria, the capital city of South Africa. If you are tuning in from your laptop, tablet or smartphone, please do hit the share button and let everybody know that episode 5 of the Internet Drive with Gregory Wordsmith is finally here. In recent times, there has been a lot of cases where a lot of women and children have suffered a great deal of violence under the hands of men. Gender-based violence has somehow become a way of resolving issues for most men in their relationships, especially with the younger generation. Whether it's the case of killing a partner or raping an innocent child, the sad reality is that South African men are gradually losing control, and it doesn't look like it's going to stop anytime soon. In today's episode, we'll be looking at the misconceptions of masculinity, and to help us dig deep into this topic, making sure we are leaving no stone unturned, on the line we have Professor Kopano Ratele. Professor Kopano Ratele is a renowned South African psychologist and an expert on men and masculinity. Professor Kopano Ratele, you are welcome to the Internet Drive with Gregory Wordsmith.
Thank you, Gregory.
First of all, Prof, thank you so much for making some time off your busy schedule to come and join us on the show. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Prof, I would like for us to start this conversation by defining masculinity. What would you say is masculinity?
Let me give you two definitions, one a technical one and one a more popular one. First, let me start with the popular one. The popular one is masculinity refers to what it means to be a man or a boy or a person in a male body, usually. The more technical definitions is one given by somebody called Raywin Cornell a while back in the 80s, and it goes something like this: that masculinity refers to a configuration of practice. By configuration, she basically means a pattern of practice. That means then that masculinity refers to those things, that ensemble of signs, performances, constructions that define men.
Professor, I intentionally made this discussion to be about the misconceptions of masculinity because I feel that we as men have got a lot of things wrong in terms of masculinity. Hence, there is a lot of violent occurrences in our communities with us as men at the center of it all. Having defined masculinity, what would you say triggers the violent behavior amongst men?
Let me take the word wrong that you mentioned. And indeed, today we'll talk about misconceptions. And in the word misconceptions, of course, there's already word conceptions. So let's do two things at once. We have already spoken about how masculinity can be defined, meaning how it is conceived. So masculinity, we said, are those things that men do or what defines men. And so misconceptions would be that the first misconception is that those things are static. It means that your grandfather, my grandfather, our grandfathers, great-grandfathers, and you go right back, that those things that define them as men have remained the same to today. And that's a misconception because masculinity is tied to a place, to a particular history, to a locale, although there are commonalities between different cultures, different places, and globally. So let's take the idea of toughness, for instance, as one of those things that are supposed to define men. And then secondly, related to that, let's take the idea of violence. Now, if you lived in a society where there's a war, we tended to send men to war. And then what happened over time is that we then associated masculinity and manhood with war. Being a warrior meant that you're a man. And then fast forward to a certain era where there's peace. It means those skills, that characteristics that trait, that behavior related to violence somehow loses its currency. You follow me, Gregory?
Yes, I'm with you, Professor.
And so those men who were warriors find themselves then not fulfilling these idealized conceptions of masculinity in peaceful times. So in that moment, because some men still hold on to that idea that being a warrior, war, toughness, violence, I'm still talking mostly about violence, and I can come back to toughness because it's related, but it's not the same thing. So men who still believe that being a warrior is the definitive characteristics of being a man somehow begin to lose out. They don't have the cultural currency. They don't fulfill the obligations of being a man because we live in peaceful times. So only then those men who are more peaceful, more non-violent, come to the fore and represent idealized forms of masculinity. But these things, of course, are not discrete. Sometimes you can have in one society people who believe in violence and peace. But you can understand that if then we have moved to a society that is more peaceful, those men who believed in warrior masculinities tend now to be at a loss about how to live in that society. Take toughness. Similarly, if you live in a society that says being tough, being in control of things is what defines a man. And then you find that you somehow are in a culture or in a place that values kindness to nature, loving other people. You begin to understand that the idea of toughness doesn't have a place in that society. Then you begin to have this disjuncture between how a man behaves, feels, things, and the society we live in. Now, why do we have a problem such as this in this country? It's because, let's take a particular example. So you were a liberation fighter. You were fighting because we just came out of 1976. So you were in struggle mode. You challenged the authorities. And then comes a time when society says, we have now to move into what, let's call them democratic forms of masculinity. Masculinities that are based on negotiation, based on talking, based on arguments. So those men who believed in a liberation struggle or in a kind of violent modes of interacting somehow are left behind. And so we are in that space. We're not quite there yet as a society, but we are in the transitional space where men have to negotiate. And let me put it in a township language. I mean, there was a form of masculinity where I was growing up where you said, we are shela. Shela means that, right? You have to talk. Yes. You have to convince a woman in relationships between men and women. And so even in that context, you can start to see that there was a masculinity that depended on talking. But even then, if you grew up in a township such as I, you knew that there were gangsters right there, Abotsotsi, who believed in a particular kind of masculinities. So more and more you have these two kinds, at least, two kinds of masculinities. A masculinity that still believes that women can be controlled by slapping them, by twisting their arms, by hitting them. And then more and more, this is where we're headed, at least as far as I can see, although there is a struggle between these two kinds of masculinities, where you have more masculinities where you have to convince somebody if you want them to be in a relationship with you. You have to talk, you have to negotiate, but also other kinds of things that do not, other men who believed in the earlier kinds of forms of masculinities find difficulty because they still hold on to that, but society is moving on.
Prof, ideally we would love to live in a society where men are negotiators, like you've just put it, instead of them resorting to violence, more especially when addressing issues that involve women. The question here is, how much effect does growing up without a father figure have on the overall character development of a boy child?
Thank you for the question, Gregory. Again, let me just one point I didn't address, and I'm going to address it quickly in less than a minute, is that because we live in a society also, our constitution encourages this and enjoins us to be equal, right? So equality is a big thing. Equality, again, is linked to feminism, so the rise of women's of women and women's empowerment. And we have a lot of programs in the society that do that women should be paid as much as men for the same kinds of jobs. Women have to have the same kinds of educational opportunities, and so on and so forth. So all those policies and programs that go towards empowering women, and some men find this threatening to them. And then they resort, because they still believe that men must be in power, men must control women, men must dominate women. In that case, then, these men find a problem with that. So let me come back then to this, your question. It starts by saying, yes, ideally, because of our constitution, because where the world is headed, we have to have this masculinities. You see, the problem of fathers is at least twofold. Let's say you grow up in a family where you don't have a father who is present in the best sense of the word, not just physically present, but emotionally present. And this father, so you don't have a father in this, and you're being raised by women, by other men. Of course, there's always other men, either grandfathers or uncles. But these men are not present in your life constantly. They're not a constant presence. So you don't have an education about how to be a man from men, from people, subjects who occupy a male body, people with penises. And let's take a simple example. A simple example is at a certain moment, boys, for instance, boys who start getting really interested in their own genitalia, penises, right? They might ask you if they are not circumcised. They are still not circumcised in many cultures in South Africa. So, Omosutu or let's say you are Tsonga somewhere, and you start asking, you want to ask somebody about when is my penis going to open, right? So that your foreskin can come back. And because you don't have somebody who has had this problem, if your father is also not circumcised, but you don't have that. You only have women. You might ask women, but really some women are also shy to speak about that. So you don't have somebody who can give you answers because they also have the same body. As somebody says, what you learn from men as a boy is to identify. Identification is a psychological concept. You have to identify with this picture in front of you. And some people use the word role modeling. Well, it's not just role modeling. It's literally role identification. You see your father, you want to be your father, you're identifying in that sense. But there's nobody like that in that family. So that's one part of the problem, Iski, because you don't have somebody who's immediate, who's present in the family, who can answer your question. But another part is, of course, you can still have a man, a male-bodied person, a biological father in the family, but they're really psychologically and emotionally absent, but also that they are not egalitarian themselves. Right? So they basically are absent. Even though their body is there, they come home, they drink, they hit your mother. And this is one of the key findings of research, that you're more likely to use violence against others if you have witnessed violence or you yourself have had violence used against you. So you grow up in a family like that. So this person might be there as a body, but they don't embody this ideal masculinity, which in this ideal we want, which is an egalitarian masculinity, a democratic masculinity, a masculinity that is non-violent.
So basically what you are saying, Prof, is that a father may be present in a child's life, but if they do not portray a good example to that child, the effects of that are as fatal as growing up without a father at all.
Absolutely. You have encapsulated in just a one sentence. So what is the strategy then, Gregory? It's as you can see, it's twofold. Basically it's one, but let's say it's twofold. If you look at the numbers we have in South Africa about the absence of biological fathers in the children's lives, it's close to 67%. So almost 70%, right? Yes. So almost 70% grow up in families where in homes where the biological father is absent. Yeah. Now, so this is the average. As a matter of fact, when you start digging into the numbers, you realize something quite interesting. There are two groups where biological fathers are absent. These are African families and colored families, to use the categories of apartheid, right? And then the people who have the highest rates of father presence are Indian. Indians somehow manage to have biological fathers in the family, followed by a wife. So I'm always interested in this because even when you look even closely, you see that something happened among Indian families, that somehow the graph was going down, and then there's an uptick again over the years. So it looks